Yeah. I think just because there's a lot to get through and time is kind of limited, I would like to stick kind of close to the outline.
Yeah, that's a
Um,
good idea.
although actually it gets more interesting once we get to the bottom of the outline. So I'll try not to dwell on stuff that is taxonomical and all these categories and stuff. I
Yeah.
mean, it is kind of interesting maybe to consider that particular approach to um, soteriology, the liberating aspect of a practice. Um, what I gather is that all of these different philosophical schools, if it's Vaiśeṣika or obviously Buddhism or Nyaya or whoever, their main purpose behind their methodology is always liberation.
Yeah.
And so it's sort of interesting to think about this extremely um, precise and detailed approach to taxonomy as a form of salvation.
Hmm.
You know, I take it the basic ethos is just something that, shared with like Socrates, this idea that um, there is a necessary connection between knowledge and goodness,
Hmm.
right? One thing Socrates is famous for saying is that no one ever knowingly does evil.
Mm.
If you're doing evil, it's because you have a false understanding of the world.
Hmm.
Um, and there you see also a commitment to this idea that being and goodness are necessarily connected, uh, so that the world, just in the fact that it exists, is good,
Yeah.
which is a fairly different conception of existence that we have from, say, a naturalistic scientific point of view, where you've got facts and values are particular emotional states that certain uh, organisms like humans or whatever, dogs or whatever, have to the facts, but they're not, they don't have some sort of special ontological status. Nothing is intrinsically good. It's just that there are facts in the world, and one further fact is that people talk about things they like and call those
Hmm.
values. That's a
Hmm.
little bit different from both, I think, the obviously the Socratic view, but also the view from Nyaya and Vaiśeṣika, but also I think from the view from Buddhism, this idea that there is something good just in the fact of existence itself.
Hmm.
I think that the Buddhists express it in a way that is kind of roundabout, and maybe we'll get to that a little bit later today. But even they, I think, essentially think that once you can get a clear view on the world, say, in the case of the Buddhists, this idea of absolute interconnectedness of everything, that in
Hmm.
itself shows that that interconnectedness is good. And so
Yeah.
even though they talk about nothing having intrinsic status, even values, there is still a sense in which value has to play a role in the way that they look at the world. The only school that I've come into contact with that might reject that picture, although even they don't, I think, reject the picture totally, is the Charvaka school, the materialists.
Right.
Um, even they, I think, have a basic view that there are certain types of activities that it's good to do. For instance, like ask yourself about value, ask yourself about truth, ask yourself about uh, how the world actually is, etc. That if you didn't think that that was good at some basic fundamental level, there would be no reason to do that versus not do anything or do something else and so on, right? And so, in order to be able to not only choose between different activities um, you could enact, but then to also teach that those are the right activities, you have to have some axiomatic conception of the good, of value.
R- Right. And
So,
I think that like stems the idea of like goodness or the value of good, I think comes from alleviating suffering for them. And I think
mhm.
that's like at the
Yeah,
first reason
so
why they attach goodness to any of this.
Right. So I mean, from that view, it's kind of interesting because then um, uh, goodness is expressed negatively. It's really just the avoidance of badness, suffering. With the Vaiśeṣika school, though, just the fact that they're so, and Nyāya as well, that they're so concerned with, accurate knowledge of reality. There it seems that, yeah, it's true that the motivation there is to avoid suffering, I suppose. But knowledge of knowledge of reality itself is what enables you to avoid suffering. And so maybe it's still just negative that knowledge doesn't bring you in contact with the good. Knowledge brings you away from the bad
Yeah.
or
Hmm.
something. And actually, I'm not totally sure with their conceptions of, well, I think I read somewhere that typically certainly, any non-dual school like the Advaita Vedanta or others that hold that everything is ultimately Brahman, they're going to have to hold that the conception of badness is parasitic on goodness. Because
Hmm.
otherwise they'd have to say that there are two fundamental forces or two fundamental values, good, evil, good, bad, or something.
Right.
Um, But what I read was that even the pluralist schools like Vaiśeṣika adopt an idea that evil isn't real.
Hmm.
Um,
Mm.
Evil is a misunderstanding of reality, and reality is good.
Huck, is this from some other readings outside of this book?
Um, I've done a lot of reading, but I would say if you are interested in getting a little bit extra and maybe even better coverage of this material, there's a podcast you can check out called The History of Philosophy in India.
Oh,
I've been listening to that. It's part of this series called The History of Philosophy Without Any Gaps by Peter Adamson.
oh.
Um, and he co-writes it. Actually, I think all the India episodes are all from like, 5 to 8 years old or so. They're
Peter, what's his
about
last name?
Peter Adamson.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, just look up the history of philosophy in India, and they're 20 to 30 minute long episodes on a bunch of different things. And
The
I
more the
actually,
more I read this book, the more I feel like it repeats itself unnecessarily
yeah, I did get
and gets a
that.
little bit detailed in ways that make it harder to get to the concepts.
I agree, and I think that not only is that the case, but it's at the expense of a number of things that are either not covered at all, like Charvaka materialism or whatever. But then also like there are certain things where, so like in this podcast, they cover a lot of the same stuff, but there's always much better philosophical insight into what it amounts to, what's at stake.
Yeah, yeah.
Whereas I do get the sense with this book a little bit that it's kind of a catalog of stuff, but I don't feel like he really gives the strongest arguments, for instance, from the point of view of Nyaya. The way that he paints Nyaya and Vaiśeṣika here is just that they're kind of obsessed with cataloging things, but it's
Yeah.
not at all obvious what the purpose of that is.
Mm.
And I do think the podcast has done a much better job than that.
Hmm.
So I still do want to read the next two chapters in this book. After that, I think I'd be happy to be done with the book. But uh, hopefully, if there is repetition, you can just go over it pretty quickly.
Yeah,
Um,
I mean, it's an interesting read because it really takes my focus still
mhm.
because it's constantly interrupted with uh, terms that I don't know.
Yeah. The other
Like
thing
I
is
have to
I've
look up some terms like, well, what is the definition of phenomenological in
oh
philosophy or
oh I see I see.
sociological?
Well,
I
that
have to do
that
that,
that's
but
going
then
to be something
also,
you'd have to do that with the podcast too.
yeah, which is okay. I like that.
Yeah.
But then also, of course, all of the Hindu terms.
Yeah. One thing that is nice about, well, both the podcast and the written forms of these terms. I mean, in the podcast, you can hear the correct pronunciations of terms, but I've also
Yeah.
figured out that the way these terms are transliterated is actually giving us where the stresses are and this kind of thing.
Mm.
And actually, I read a little folk tale or myth or whatever. I guess it comes from the grammarian Patanjali,
Mm,
and the story is something like Indra. Uh, there's some magician or something that summons a snake. I think
mm,
Virti or something like that is the name of the snake,
mm.
and uh, I'll see if I can find the exact. I think I probably lost the exact. Oh yeah, here it is. Um, so apparently, when this magician is summoning this serpent to kill Indra, he mispronounces the spell. And he doesn't the mispronunciation is just he puts the emphasis on the wrong syllable. And so I think if it's like uh if it's sorry, I've been having a cold, and so now that I'm
Oh
talking,
no.
I'm probably gonna be coughing a lot. Sorry about that. Um yeah, so like if you say I think it's if you say Indra Shastru, then
Mm.
it means destroyer of Indra. But if you say Indra Shastru, then it means Indra is the enemy. And that's the way that the magician pronounces it. And because he mispronounces it, puts the stress on the wrong syllable, Indra
Uh,
is able to defeat the serpent instead of the serpent defeating Indra.
Hmm.
it's like that Uris that we read about, the in no one's base,
Hmm.
where the first myth or whatever, where the person
Oh,
comes to
oh,
like
you're talking about Oedipus, or not Oedipus, Odysseus, and saying that what's your
yeah,
name? And it's anyway, it's a play on the name Odysseus. But it's just a pun that means no one, right? And you get a similar kind of thing. One second. In any case, I mean, this is all just kind of
mhm.
banter. But yeah, no, I take your point, Matt. There are some respects in which the book isn't
Yeah,
uh
no, I'm not trying to
yeah.
complain. I'm just saying it's just it's interesting. The more I read it, the more I get a sense for maybe what
Well,
it's accomplishing and
here's
what
how
it's
I
not.
yeah, here's how I would here's how I approach it, and maybe this would be a good model for you to adopt, maybe not. I mean, I think that one thing that's good about the fact that he doesn't necessarily present the strongest arguments of certain positions is that if you're so inclined, it's an invitation for you to think about these questions and develop the positions yourself, which then will help you remember them, will help you, kind of think through them. And so it is kind of just a schematic presentation of lots of facts. Um, But part of what we bring to this, as opposed to just reading the book and reciting what was in the book, is discussing what these things
Yeah,
must amount to, right?
yeah,
And
yeah.
so,
That's what we're trying to do here for
yeah,
sure.
yeah. So,
I'm just like it's interesting because it takes me a lot of focus
mhm,
and sometimes I get lost in it, and I don't know that I have enough background like
yeah,
you, Huck, or you,
that's fine.
Sandesh, to think through things to their logical conclusions.
Well,
But
I'm bringing a lot myself that's
you,
not in the book, so
yeah,
I'll try
it's
to
great.
make things more interesting. Maybe we could fire up the whole outline though.
Sounds good.
And just kind of run through it. And I'll gloss over some of the stuff in the beginning, and then I'll
Yeah,
pause on places that are maybe a little more interesting. Uh, so let me get that up first. Yeah, okay. So, back to this idea of ontology, knowledge of what really exists as a source of liberation. Um, I think that part of what we can read from this is, um, just a collection of rules or a collection of, you know, heuristics, rules of thumb, or whatever that might show how to live a life of virtue. And what I mean by that is, for instance, like some time ago, I was talking about how debate, when it's done well, is also done fair,
Mm,
right? That fair debate is something that is part of the definition of good debate. And so that also in finding different ways to enumerate strategies, rules, or whatever to debate fairly is also showing you a way to interact with other people in a virtuous way, right?
mm,
And so that's one way of looking at this as just sort of a guidebook on, how to live. Also, seeking truth rather than falsity is itself just good, So that's, I think, kind of the picture that they're coming to this with. But then also, being able to figure out what kind of relationship your own self has to the rest of material reality, even the rest of your own mental life. They have this idea that the self is distinct from consciousness.
mhm,
That is supposed to also perhaps clue you into how it could be possible that even though everything seems to be different, um, at least with respect to Atman, there's this sort of maybe unity to the world. Uh, so all of that, I think, is kind of the basis of the approach that they're taking here, and it does um, kind of bleed over into excruciating detail in certain respects, but I think that the detail itself is also kind of interesting. And you can also think of detailed analysis and detailed mm, argumentation and so on as a kind of spiritual exercise. In the following sense that, if you're just going through life and you're just assuming this or that is true, this or that is true because there's no particular reason to question it, um, there's sort of a sense that you're not really developing your mind and your relationship with the world. You're just sort of on autopilot. And so I think that this really precise and detailed thinking through how things could be related, and when certain things that seem to be contradictions come up, how can you analyze it even further to maybe get a deeper, more nuanced relationship to the things you know, to the world that you experience, and so on. I think that that can all be thought of as essentially like a spiritual exercise. Um, I mean, we maybe we'll just run through really quickly some of the basic elements of Nyaya and Vaiśeṣika ontology. First of all, it's a pluralist ontology that holds that I take it they get this from Samkhya that there's Purusha, or there's a sort of or at least Atman
mhm,
is distinct from uh, um, the rest of the world, right? So there's a distinction between mind and consciousness, but there's also within mind a distinction between mind and self. So they're
mhm,
like almost like a double dualist
mhm.
position, mind, body, but then mind itself is dual. Um, and essentially, it should also be said that Nyaya rejects the idea that we could ever give a complete classification of reality. That's something that the Vaisešikas are trying to do, but Nyaya already, which comes a little bit later, rejects that possibility. But with respect to what exists, the Vaisešikas basically um, think that there are material objects and there are uh, also various categories of things that aren't themselves necessarily material. So within the material objects, you get things like um, the elements of earth, water, fire, air, and then ether.
Mhm.
And I don't know if it's that interesting. It's maybe just sort of a trivia or something, but each of them has a distinct uh, quality or a distinct property. So, for instance, I think earth um, involves smell.
Yeah.
And I don't remember all of them. I don't think I wrote it down here, but for instance, I think water involves taste, fire involves vision, air involves touch, and they also build up. So
Yeah.
that I think air involves touch, and then fire involves sight and touch, and then so on
Color.
up through earth, which involves all of them. But the one thing that's interesting is they also have this fifth element, ether
Mm.
or akasa. And what I gather is that the only thing that akasa does is act as a medium for sound.
That's what it sounds
Yeah.
like. Yeah.
Yeah, and so it's sort of interesting. It seems like what they're doing in developing these five um, material elements is actually just finding like a material correlate for the five senses, right? And so there's this maybe interesting connection, even though it's a dualist school, between matter and uh, consciousness, at least, or mind. That is to say that um, when we sense something, there's a distinction between, say, the eye as a sense organ and the quality of the things that the eye senses. Or maybe one way to say this is that there's a difference between um, sound understood as a, material event or material object in a medium and the phenomenal awareness of a sound, right? So maybe you could think of it as the difference, to use slightly confusing language, the difference between a sound that might exist out there objectively as a material object or material event and sound understood in terms of listening, right? Like in order to hear something, there's got to be both the object out there, but then also um, there's got to be some kind of substrate or some kind of medium that acts almost like an agent
Mhm.
that is able to use that sound to have an experience or something like that.
Yeah.
So there is this tight connection between the material world and the non-material world. And you see that
Akasha
in,
is also space. It also
well,
means
no,
space.
space, they they have a different they call it space deek, and
Eek.
it's
Hmm.
taken to be a different substance
Oh,
from
interesting.
Akasa. And the basic difference is that Akasa here, in at least in the Vaiśeṣika tradition, is just the medium for sound, whereas Deek is like the framework for positional
Mhm. Yeah.
relationships, right?
Hmm.
Uh-huh.
And so one is material, even though it's invisible, you can't sense the medium of Akasa itself. It is nonetheless material because it acts as the vehicle for sound,
Mm.
whereas space is not perceptible and doesn't even really act as the vehicle for some kind of perceptual object like a sound, but rather it's the framework within which you can encounter a difference of position.
It's
Yeah.
relational. Yeah.
In
Yeah.
conventional use, Akasha, we refer to it as the sky.
Oh, is that right? That's
Yeah.
interesting. Yeah, well, ether also has the sense of like a kind of completely transparent medium. In fact, certain Greek authors that wanted to analyze what exists in reality also posit a substrate like this ether. But it has that sense of being something like a medium that's required for certain objects to be encountered at all,
Yeah.
as opposed to space, which is not the frame. Space isn't what enables, for instance, sounds or visual objects or whatever to be encountered at all. It's what enables us to compare
Yeah.
them in
But they
terms of
also talk
their
about
position.
time that way,
Hmm.
Atman and the mind as these. I mean,
Yeah.
that's my notes. The non-material substances are
Hmm.
kala, time, dik, space,
Yeah.
Atman, and
Now,
mind.
one thing that's kind of interesting about this. So we've already kind of gone into this idea of the categories.
Mm.
Mhm.
And first of all, just to name the categories that we've got here, you've got substance, and all material objects, all of the elements are examples of substances.
Mhm.
And then you've got those four immaterial substances. That's
Yeah.
Dravya. But then you've got a bunch of other categories of reality, quality, which you can think of as properties or something like that. Actions, universals, particulars, inherence, and then later absence. But what's
Yeah.
interesting about this word category, as far as I understand, padartha, is that it literally means the referent of a word.
Yeah.
Now, this is pretty interesting because normally we would think that, well, what refers is language, and language is some conventional medium that we use to maybe cut up reality or to, you know, catalog reality or make sense of reality or something like this. And so reference is like something we do mentally or linguistically to pick out certain things in the world. But what they're saying is these categories are basically linguistic, except what is the language that is referring here?
Well, doesn't it come back to that idea of Sanskrit as the holy language
That's
that?
right. I think that that's right, that there's this idea that these things exist because reality is actually set up in the
Yeah.
structure of a referring language,
Yeah.
right? And so
That's what
it's
I got
like,
from it.
yeah, the divine
Revelation.
language is actually referring to these material objects, for instance,
Yeah.
in the very fact that they exist.
It's a
Hmm.
very chicken and egg kind of argument, isn't it? I mean, language.
I mean, the reason I think that you would want to have a theory like this, and actually Aristotle has a pretty similar theory,
Oh.
is that there's a danger that if you don't set it up at that basic axiomatic level, that there is this relationship between reality and reference or reality and language, then it's hard to make the case that when we say something about reality, we're actually saying something true about reality.
Uh,
Right, unless there's something about reality itself that is amenable to that structure of reference.
mhm.
Right. And so the way they're setting it up is basically that the reason that we're able to say, here's my stupid blue cup that I always use as an example for this kind of thing. The very fact that I'm able to say that is that reality is structured in the following sense that reality is itself a language that in referring um, underwrites the ability for this thing to exist as an object.
Mhm.
Right.
Very Kantian in a way, with the a priori
Maybe,
conditions which I can understand.
except for the fact that, as far as I understand, this is not idealist in any sense, right?
Mm,
That's why it's more Aristotelian, right? It's this idea that no, reality is basically just a language,
mm,
and we use language too. Um, Now, one thing I haven't been able to ascertain is if they have the same kind of sense of a finite use of language or finite knowledge versus infinite knowledge or infinite, sort of perfect use of a language or perfect reference versus imperfect reference between, say, humanity and the divine or something like that. I'm not sure exactly the extent to which they would hold that when we do
mm.
it right, we can refer in a divine way, in just the way that reality refers when it brings about objects.
It seems like they say they can. It seems like it's always this question about like how we have to bring things back to conventional language, and that
Well,
that is our best way of trying to express the divine. But I remember one paragraph where it says this is a very slippery or difficult to grasp concept.
yeah. Well, what I would say about the relationship between language and convention, and it's
Oh.
very interesting here, is that they agree with Madhyamaka, Nagarjuna, the Buddhists, and so on, that language is conventional.
Hmm.
Where they disagree, however, is the source of the convention,
Mm.
right?
Yes.
And
Right.
and so
Right.
the Vaiśeṣikas are basically saying, yeah, it's conventional, but it's the creator's convention.
Yes, that's right.
Now, one of the things that's interesting about that,
But the Buddha, I was talking more about the Buddhists. The Buddhists are,
well, the Buddhists say
they
it's
reject
conventional
that.
too. It's just that
Yeah.
I suppose they would hold that it's a human convention,
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
whereas Vaiśeṣika, and I presume Nyāya too, are saying yes, it is conventional,
Comes
but
from
it's
the
the
creator's language.
the
Yeah, the divine.
divine's convention.
That's right.
So what that would mean is that it is both conventional and necessary,
Mm.
Mm.
which is not a normal pair to bring together in
Mm.
um,
Mhm.
in some entity, right? So it's like, um, however, you can also kind of think of it in the following way. You were bringing up Kant, so I'll use a little bit of Kantian terminology. I mean, it's kind of like the difference between a regulative use of a concept and a constitutive use. Um, but you maybe think about it this way, like when you write a piece of music, you can do whatever you want. It's actually kind of arbitrary. Yeah, there's some, limitations. You're writing for a specific ensemble or whatever, but with respect to the material, you don't have to start with a C major triad. You can if you want. You don't have to. It's kind of arbitrary where you start with the material. But there's a strong sense that once you've chosen material, even though that choice was arbitrary, the subsidiary choices aren't arbitrary. There's a kind of logic that's set up just in the making of some kind of axiomatic choice.
Mhm.
If you're being
Um,
intelligent.
what's that?
If you're being intelligent,
If you're being intelligent. Well, even if you're not being that intelligent, I mean,
you're probably led certain ways, yeah.
if you start off and it's like this is going to be like a mid-tempo groove track, and then you're like, you know what? I would really like it to like have a big cymbal crash here, but
Yeah,
that wouldn't really fit.
right.
That intuition that X or Y wouldn't fit is actually what I'm describing,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
It's a sense that even though the initial choice was arbitrary or conventional or whatever word you want to use there, there is a kind of necessity that follows from that choice,
yeah.
Mhm.
right? And I think that that's what they're saying about this idea that the language of the universe is this divine convention.
Hmm.
One of the things that's interesting, though, is that in say medieval philosophy, you've got this idea. Is if you ever heard of divine command theory, it's an ethical theory that holds that any action that is good is not good for its own sake. It's not good because of the outcomes it produces. Rather, it's good because God commands it. So that God, and we don't know why God commands it, but just because God commands it, it's good.
Yeah.
And you get a very similar idea here, but now with respect to truth
Hmm.
instead of morality. And so it's like, this is a blue cup is true, I guess, on some level, just because the divine creator decided that that is what
So
it would be.
in their
There's,
view, Sanskrit always existed since the beginning of the time or something like it was in the beginning there was Sanskrit, for example.
yeah, I think that that's correct. I think that the Greek version of that would be in the beginning was the word,
Yeah,
Mhm.
yeah,
something
yeah.
like this, right? That
Right. And the word was good or whatever they say. Yeah.
that's right. Yeah, yeah. And so, there is something that's kind of interesting about that, and it requires me jumping over a couple things here. But it is related to what they have to say about the relationship between parts and wholes.
Mm.
And it has to do with this idea of organization.
Mhm.
Um, we won't go through all the detail of their theory of actually they have two theories of wholes, one spelled with a W and one spelled without a W, because they also have that theory of absences.
Mhm.
But with respect to wholes, they've got this idea, excuse me, they've got this idea that so you've got substances, which are both the material elements and so on, but also things like mind, self, etc.
Time, yeah.
And properties, qualities, these kinds of things are all substances. And certain substances inhere in other substances.
Right.
So, like for instance, actually, presumably consciousness or mind inheres in the self, and then I suppose other things can inhere in consciousness, like material perceptions and these kinds of things are like modifications of consciousness, which is a modification of self, Atman, and so on. And then they say holes with a W, holes inhere in essentially all of that.
Hmm.
Mhm.
Now, let's go back to last week where we were talking about, the Buddhist rejection of that idea, the idea of anatman and the analogy of the chariot, right? So the chariot analogy there is meant to show that you don't have to have this extra kind of metaphysical postulate of a self because, in the example of the chariot, there is no chariot over and above the parts that make up the chariot. So here's the way that the theory of wholes is a response to that. There's a difference between a chariot understood in terms only of its parts, as just like a collection of objects, versus a chariot understood as a whole, which is an organized collection of objects. Like one way you
Mhm.
could say it is that the Buddhists would have to say that because this Lego house that I just built is actually reducible to all the individual blocks. The Lego house is identical to the bag of Legos that I bought before I put it together.
Yeah.
And the idea of the whole is not just this kind of interesting and abstract analysis. It's meant to say that organization is real,
Hmm.
that there is actually a difference between disorganized collections of parts and organized collection of parts. The
Mhm.
organized collection of parts means that the organization is there in addition to the parts.
I thought that was more the Nyaya. How do you say the other word? Basilic. How do you say the other
Nyāya,
word?
Nyāya,
Nyaya and the other with a V. How do you say
Vaiśeṣika.
Vaiśeṣika? I thought that was
Yeah.
more their reality. I thought the Buddhists were saying that. Remember, there's this part in the book that actually, for the first time, made me laugh. Where he said,
Uh,
where he basically said, "Well, if you move your hand, and they
mhm.
would say that you'd move your whole body, or
Right.
and then
Yeah.
try banging your head on the." I thought that was more the
Yeah.
Nyaya position,
What
and
was more than the Nyāya position? Which position are you
that
pointing at?
this part about the whole
Yeah.
being. Is that what you're saying?
That is
Is
what
that?
I'm saying. Well,
Oh, okay. I thought you
I'll
said it
try
was.
to be more clear, I guess.
No, it's
Buddhists
fine.
are so the Buddhists we're encountering here anyway. So Madhyamaka, Nagarjuna, and his
Yeah.
commentators and so on, are what in terminology is sometimes called mereological nihilists, which means that they hold that if any object, anything is ever reducible
Mm.
to more basic parts, then that thing that can be reduced is not real.
Hmm. Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
what they
Okay.
say.
I get it.
So that's
Yeah.
why they say that the chariot, as an example, as an analogy to the self,
Mm.
is meant to show that just because you can reduce the chariot down to all of the functions that it has, all of the parts that
Mm.
it has, and so on, that shows that the chariot itself is just like a summary of all that. It's
Yeah.
not
Sure.
a real object in addition to all those parts.
Right.
And the Nyaya position is that um, no, if that were true, then it would be just like saying if you buy a bag of Lego bricks,
You have a
that's just identical to the house that you might build out of it or whatever
right.
other thing you might build out of it. Um, there's a sense that when we're talking about the whole of a thing as inhering in its parts,
Yeah.
we're talking about the fact that those parts have this organized structure to them, and that the organized structure, I mean, it's not a material object in the way that the bricks are, but just because it's material doesn't mean it's not real,
Hmm.
right? That there is actually something in addition to the parts that is the organization of those parts. That's what the whole is
Yeah.
essentially. And
Right.
the problem is that the way that they define it is um, as follows. They basically take what now we would call like a supervenience approach, which means that you've got like the parts, and then the whole is somehow like this meta structure that emerges from the parts.
Right.
And
Right.
what that means is that if any of the parts changes, the whole changes,
Hmm.
which in their particular analysis of it, this isn't something that follows necessarily, but their particular analysis of it means that every time a part changes, you get a new whole.
Yeah.
Um, And from the Buddhist perspective, the problem is that it also suggests that the whole is present in all of its parts,
Yeah. Right.
right? Um, Actually, there are pretty easy ways to get out of that problem, right? If you really take like a supervenience or emergent property approach to a whole, then you don't have to claim that the whole is present in all of its parts. You can say
Yeah.
that the whole is only present when all of its parts are organized in just the right way.
Right.
you
Right.
know. But I think that the stronger thing that is maybe a little bit more of a problem for the Buddhists is this idea that organization is real. It's not necessarily a problem for the Buddhists for a few reasons that we'll maybe get to. Because what I basically figured out with Nagarjuna is that you have to take what he's doing as something other than making arguments. Because he's not really making arguments. He's doing something that looks exactly like making arguments, but um, the way that his sentences, the way that his words function is not like an argument.
Mm.
But essentially, the thing is that uh, so the Nyayas and the Vaiṣeshikas in saying that organization is real, one of the things that they're saying, I suppose to a certain extent, is that sense of relatedness in reality, which is so important to the Buddhists. That is real, right? So I think they would agree on that. I can't remember what the problem was that I was bringing up.
Was it about like describing hoarseness as everything that is not a horse? Is
Well,
it describing stuff in the negative?
that's a little bit different because hoarseness is a universal. It's not a
Okay.
whole.
Anyway, I don't mean to distract you. I just wondered
Yeah,
if that would help
yeah,
you get
yeah.
back on
No,
track.
there was some thing I wanted to say about in any case. I think that that's maybe the most interesting way to read what's going on with this whole talk about wholes as a
Hmm.
way of talking about organization as something that is real and indispensable. In fact, to a certain extent, as long as all the parts are functioning in the right way, it's not something you can really reduce out in the way that, say, the Buddhists or, Gilbert Ryle or whoever try to reduce out when they say that no, the chariot is just all the stuff that makes up the chariot. There is this sense that no, there's a very important distinction between a disorganized collection of parts and an organized collection of parts.
Mhm.
Yeah. I'm just going over my own notes on that whole subject again. Yeah, it was interesting. I never thought about that before, honestly.
Well, I think that we do think about that kind of thing quite often, honestly, like like when you're making a piece of music, for instance.
Sure.
What
Yeah,
makes
of
a good piece
course.
of music? The fact that it's organized in a way that is powerful, right?
Yeah,
Instead of
no,
just being,
I'm saying
yeah.
at this level of reality.
Well, that's why I want to describe it just in terms of organization as something that is not just reducible to the parts that are employed in the organization, right?
Hmm.
That there is a sense that organization as something that can be described as the interfunctioning of the parts
Hmm.
is actually something that's distinct from those parts,
Hmm.
right? Because you can have all just the same parts, all the same Lego bricks in a bag, and it's going to be significantly different from the Lego bricks organized to make whatever house or
This
dog
sentence
or
stuck
whatever.
out to me. In Buddhist thought, these Dharma constituents, on the grounds that in Mayahana Buddhist thought, these Dharma constituents on the, I guess I'm missing a word here, on the grounds that all Dharmas arise in mutual dependence and thus are devoid of their own independent existence.
Hmm.
They're completely dependent on each other, but each one is empty. Even the concept of emptiness is empty. And that can get to a nihilistic viewpoint, except that they say that it's not. It's just the perception of
Yeah,
reality
yeah, yeah. That's
is
why there's
being.
a lot of agreement, I think, between the Nyaya Vaiṣeṣika theory of wholes and interdependent being, or
Mhm.
interdependent arising, or the translation is that you want to use. Uh, I suppose maybe one more important distinction, though, is like the attitude you take to that recognition, right?
Yeah.
Which is maybe how you use it, So like, I suppose that there's maybe more of a positive attachment to the
Hmm.
theory in Vaiṣeṣika and in Buddhism. When you say, here's the problem. We'll get through the rest of this and then we'll talk about Buddhism and I'll spend a little bit more time on this. When you say that emptiness, the position of emptiness is not a position,
Mm.
that can only work if you take that. sentence that looks like a proposition, looks like something you would use in an argument, if
Yeah.
you interpret it as doing something other than making an argument,
Yeah. Right.
right? Um, and so, to the extent that there's a positive relationship of Buddhism to this idea of a whole as organization or interdependent being or this kind of thing, um, it's going to be more like a practical, uh, practice-oriented affirmation and not a argument, is not a position that they're forming,
Hmm.
because otherwise the position is always going to be a sort of negative relationship to, or a defeasible relationship to interdependent being. Even interdependent being might be false or something
Yeah.
like that, right?
Right.
Um, okay. A couple interesting things I think to talk about with uh, this idea of absences. So that's something we could spend some time on. Maybe we'll just go through the list of categories and stop where it gets interesting. So we've talked about substances, which is the the five material elements, and then four immaterial ones: time, space, soul, which is Atman or self, and mind or consciousness, manas. Um, then you've got qualities, which are modifications of those things. So that would be like hotness or coldness or whatever, various things like
Mhm.
that. Then you've got actions, and the distinction between actions and qualities is that qualities are essentially fixed, at least temporarily fixed, whereas actions are ongoing, they're dynamic. Um, they're also short-lived as opposed to qualities which are longer in duration. Um, You've got the universals and the particulars, which are important, and then you've got this idea of inherence. We spent a lot of time now on inherence, which was this idea of wholes
Mhm.
inhering in a collection of parts. So we could spend a little bit more time both on the question of universals and particulars, if that's interesting, or we can get straight away to the most interesting thing, which is their theory of absence.
I had one thing to mention with the
Hmm.
inherence thing where
Hmm.
they bring up the example of the blue pot,
Hmm.
and they say that the blue color blue is inherent in the pot.
Hmm.
And then I was thinking, well, I could paint it red and
Yeah.
it
So
wouldn't
so
be,
right.
except for let's say Taj Mahal,
Uh-huh.
and someone paints it red, I would still think whiteness is inherent in Taj Mahal as
I,
opposed to just like, I don't know.
right. I would say two things about that. First of all, you're actually very close to a criticism that Buddhist commentators make with respect to how can a whole be made up of parts that have different gunas, different properties from the parts. So that's one problem. The second thing that I would want to clear up is just that there is a distinction between inherence and essence, right?
Mm.
That saying that the blueness inheres in a pot just means that there is a hierarchical relationship between the substance, the clay or whatever, the earth, and the guna, blueness,
Hmm.
even in a universal instantiation. It doesn't mean that blue is essential to the pot. It just means that
Mm.
there's a hierarchical relationship between this more fundamental substance, which is, say, earth, and the modification of that substance, which is blueness.
Hmm.
Hmm.
Right. And so when you paint it red, yeah, it's not blue anymore. Now redness and red, also the color and also its universal in here in the pot.
Hmm. But it's not essential.
It's
It's
not
that.
essential. Exactly right.
Right.
Yeah. So that's a distinction. Inherence doesn't mean that it's essential, which is actually kind of good because um maybe it's not good, but at least it's consistent because just the fact that inherence isn't essential means that whenever a part changes, you get a new whole. Because
Yeah.
if inherence were essential, then you would have to say somehow the whole changes instead of becoming a new
Hmm.
whole.
Hmm.
Is it clear what I'm saying?
Yeah. So, because, yeah, they bring about these two sorts of conjunctions, a necessary conjunction where entities don't remain the same once they're separated,
Hmm.
and then a contingent conjunction that they
Hmm.
can be separated without changing the fundamental nature of the parts.
Hmm.
So that's why I was wondering if the blueness is like a necessary conjunction or inherence versus a contingent. Um,
I see. Yeah, that's a good question. I have to look at that again. And they say that inherence is what? It's it's a necessary conjunction, not contingent. Whole inheres in parts cannot exist without parts, but is distinct from them. Okay. Yeah, that's right. And the necessary right. I think what still even so, it doesn't mean here necessary, I don't think is describing the status of being of um the relationship between the substance and what inheres in the substance. It's just the relationship. What I mean by that is if inherence just means um that, say, a property modifies a substance in such a way that something is changed, that means that it's a necessary connection. Whereas if I, place my phone on my cup, I'm modifying the cup to a certain extent, but not in a way that changes the substance of the cup and the substances that, underlie the properties of the cup and so on. Now,
Mhm.
that doesn't mean that once I change a substance by, applying some property that inheres in it, okay, so the property inheres in the substance because it's changing some aspect of the substance. But I could always replace that, I suppose, with a different property that would change the substance in a different way. And you still have inherence, but there's nothing essential about which property it is.
Yeah. It was funny because when I got to that word in here, I was like, I looked it up and just put it in my notes. And this
Hmm.
doesn't necessarily apply. I like what you're saying, Huck, but the
Hmm.
definition that I got from just Googling it was definition of in here is exist essentially or permanently in. And so
Yeah.
it's funny because it could lead you in a different direction than what you're arguing, but I like what you're arguing.
Well,
It's not
yeah.
essential.
I mean, I'm just repeating some of the stuff that's here. I think that, or some of the stuff that's in the book. I think though that more important than looking up inherence would be to look at the definition and etymology of samavaya, which is the word they're using.
Ah,
Um, but I also agree that there are certain things that seem like they contradict different positions.
yeah.
And I take it that that's probably because we're trying to get a panoptic view of several authors over about 1,000-year period or so that may have different ideas on different things. So there's bound to be some disagreement about certain things. But with respect, for instance, to the idea that a property both inheres in a substance and yet can be changed, right?
Ah, yeah. Right.
Yeah, I mean, if it's true that
Mhm.
blueness inheres in the clay, the substance of the pot, but you could paint it some other color or,
Yeah, exactly.
bleach it out or whatever,
Yeah.
then though whatever the new property is would adhere, but the property has changed.
Yeah.
So it can't
That
be
makes more
that it's
sense.
essential in the sense that, I mean, maybe it could be essential in the following sense. If you take the thing being defined to be the composite blue pot, then a blue pot is
Yeah.
essentially blue.
Yes.
But the pot isn't essentially blue,
That's right.
right? Something like that maybe would
But
be a way
blue
to get
pot
around
has
it.
to have blue.
Yeah. Right,
Yeah,
exactly.
and it's interesting. Yeah, that whole part was fascinating to me. How they were arguing back and like, what if you cut the cloth in two? What happens then? You know,
Hmm.
and what do you
Hmm.
have? And
Hmm. Yeah, right. I mean, I think that one thing that's kind of interesting though, if that analysis is correct, that okay, so maybe you can combine essence, essentiality, and inherence. It's just that it depends at what level of description you're analyzing the object.
yeah,
If you're
that's
analyzing it as a pot versus a blue pot, or if you're analyzing it as clay versus a clay pot versus a
right.
blue clay pot. right? And
Right.
I think that that's kind of interesting. Um, in a certain sense, it aligns them closely with their critics, the Buddhists, with this idea of different sort of levels of description as being uh, a it's a way of looking at how perspective changes what we take to be real,
Hmm.
right? Is it clay? Is it a clay pot? Is it a blue clay pot? And so on. I think the difference, though, is that, and I'm not sure if I'm being accurate in this, but I think that they think that all of those different levels of reality, or levels of, let me say it this way, all of those different levels of description are actually real. I think I read that somewhere, which is
Mm.
to say that, a chair is real. It's not that a chair isn't real. A chair is real even though it's made up of atoms, right? And it's because the whole is real. The particular organization of it is real, right? And the organization might exist as a chair. It might exist as this or that particular set of molecules that are in
Hmm.
a sort of, or atoms, or it might be a classroom full of chairs or something.
Mm.
But I suppose that these are all just different levels of description. But because the levels of description are actually different ways of describing wholes as organizing principles ranging over sets of entities, sets of properties, and so on, that those wholes all exist simultaneously, but they're also all real. It's not
It,
just that they're sort of perspectives. There's a sense in which the organization is just as real.
Yeah, it seems like they acknowledge that it's real, but at the same time, at some level, I don't know if this is the right term, conventional, but ultimate truth is that they're empty and that it's all dharma, right? It's all changing. That's the other part about it. Somehow they live
Are you
with
talking about
both
the Buddhists
perspectives.
now, I think?
Yeah, the Buddhists.
Yeah, I'm talking about Nyaya still,
Oh, okay, I
right?
got it.
Nyaya and Vaiśeṣika. Here's one benefit of saying that levels of description are actually describing levels of reality
Mm,
because wholes, as whole just means this particular organization of things.
yeah.
Those wholes are real. If you want to deny that, which is what the Buddhists do, they deny that anything that can be reduced is real, then you have to be in this very sort of, um, I don't know, I have to say, it reminds me of that subreddit that used to be called I'm 14 and this is deep. It's like, oh, but is the chair really there? It's like, yeah, the chair's there, okay?
Yeah.
It's real because the organization is
Go to
real.
school.
You know what
Yeah.
I'm saying? I mean, I always feel like the radical skepticism. First of all, I have to say that um, once you get clear on uh, Nagarjuna and that whole kind of skepticism as a type of speech act and not as a proposition,
Okay.
then it's a little bit less annoying. But taken as a proposition, oh, are you sure the chair's there? Because it's made of atoms, man. It always feels kind of dumb. It's like the chair is real because the particular organization of the chair, which means both its like atomic structure and whatever, but also its capacity to function in a certain way, capacity
Hmm.
to, at least with respect to us, be solid, even though it's not literally solid or not solid
Hmm.
on a, submolecular level or whatever. Um, but that doesn't mean that the organization isn't real. A chair
Hmm.
is real.
Hmm.
That
Yeah.
that and there is something refreshingly just kind of common sense about that.
Yeah.
That it's like, yeah, I mean, chairs are real. Um, I guess one thing you could say is that whether or not chairs are real is irrelevant if all you're concerned with is, how you might use them or so on. I mean, it's like if you can use a chair in a certain way, it doesn't really matter that its organization is real in some sense. It's just it works to sit on or something like that. And so that would be a way to both keep the kind of practical common sense aspect to it without going down the path of saying that organizational principles are ultimately real in the same way that, say, an atom is real or something like that.
Hmm.
Um, yeah, okay, so maybe what else do we want to say? I don't really want to say very much about one thing that is kind of interesting though with universals in particulars is that apparently, and this is maybe a kind of complication to what I was just saying, is that particularity, is never a property of objects. So this cup is not a particular cup. It is a particular cup, but only because its atoms are particular,
Hmm.
right? And so they have this kind of sense of, yeah, the whole is real because the organization is real, but um, what makes it specific, like an actual specific thing that I can point out and do things with, is the fact that its atoms are numerically distinct, quantitatively distinct, although not necessarily, in fact, not qualitatively distinct. There's
Hmm.
this idea that, an Earth atom is exactly the same as any other Earth atom. It's just that they're in different spatial locations,
Hmm.
Mm.
right?
Huck's blue cup is the same as Sandish's blue cup at some level, but it
I'm
can
not
be
sure that that would be true because they're probably organizationally different in. Remember that, like, the example he gives in the book is if you make a mark with
yeah,
chalk on a chalkboard, then you now have a different piece of chalk.
yeah, yeah.
Right. So they're always going to be, with respect to objects, which are just these, vast conglomerations of atoms and different organizations and so on, even though they look basically the same, there's always going to be some
Something
difference, which is
different,
going
yeah.
to make them qualitatively distinct in a way. But
Yeah.
really, what makes them distinct as specific objects is the fact that their atoms are,
Just
even though exactly the same with respect to their qualities, they're just different atoms,
yeah, they're different atoms, distinct.
numerically
Yeah,
different.
right.
Um,
Can I ask
yeah,
you one thing? To just ask you
sure.
to to just reiterate one more time for me
Yeah.
because I thought that was the most illuminating part for me of this
Uh-huh.
conversation so far. The Buddhist perspective not being an argument.
We're gonna get there. So let's
Okay,
let's
good.
let's jump. In fact, actually, kind of a good segue into that is to talk about the Vaiśeṣika theory of absence.
Mm,
Because one thing that's kind of interesting, I think you see it here, and there are some other examples of this kind of thing, that there's kind of a rapprochement between Nyaya Vaiśeṣika and Buddhism, but it only happens in the 12th century when Buddhism was starting to disappear in India.
right, right.
And so then
They
it's sort of
conceded
like,
some points
yeah, because they
and
didn't
then they left.
they didn't see them as a rival anymore or something. I'm not sure,
Yeah, yeah.
But yeah, the theory of absence is similar in some ways to the theory of emptiness, but it's still significantly different in some ways. So, uh, you know, um, this idea that absences can be known
Hmm.
is interesting. So, one thing that I haven't spelled out explicitly here, it is in the outline, but they, just like, say, in medieval Europe, they have this belief that if you can ever say something true about something, then that thing is must exist. If I could say something true about this blue cup, like I'm holding this blue cup and that's true, then that blue cup must exist,
Yeah.
right? That's something that they believe. Now, with respect to absences, um, this is, I think, the reason that they argue that absences are real,
Mhm.
because you can say true things about absences.
I can't find my cup.
What's that?
I can't
Yeah.
find my cup or the empty wallet or that kind of idea.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Now, there is, I came across one Buddhist objection to this, which is the idea that when I can't find my blue cup, it's not that I find the like a negative blue cup or something.
No, right.
What you do is you find something and you just mark that the expected thing isn't there.
Yeah.
Right. But then they come up with slightly more interesting examples that where that objection doesn't work quite as well. And this is the sort of thing where, like, you are specifically looking for the absence of something.
Yes.
So like in the case of the blue cup, I'm looking for the presence of the blue cup and I don't find it. But
Yeah.
if I'm looking for the absence of something and I do find it, like for instance, their example is like, let's say I ask you to go to that pile of cloths over there and pick out the one that doesn't have marks on it.
Hmm.
well, now what you're doing is looking for the absence of marks.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Or like if you're, let's say you're doing your taxes or something, and you're looking, let's see, to make this exactly right, it couldn't be looking to see if you forgot to write something down.
Mm-hmm.
Like, but if you're looking for a gap in
Right.
your information or something, right?
Right.
Then it's kind of interesting because really the thing you're seeking out is the absence of something.
Yeah,
It's
that's
not,
right.
yeah. And so that is kind
They
of the
say that's
basis.
real.
They
Yeah,
say it's real, and knowable,
yeah, right.
right? Because I can know that this clock doesn't have marks on it.
Yeah.
Um, you know, so that's I think pretty interesting, and
Yeah.
it's kind of a way of connecting back up with the kind of anatman procedure position,
So
whatever,
if you
of
said, I'm
Buddhism.
looking for holes in the argument of the Nyaya
Hmm.
position or holes in the argument of the Buddhist position,
Hmm.
but you didn't know they were there or not, how does
Okay,
that?
well, first of all, I'd want to know. Um, so are you
I'm,
suggesting that
po-
like let me just clarify this to myself. Are you suggesting, for instance, that like holes in an argument would be a kind of absence? Is that what you're saying?
yeah, that's what I'm trying to line
Uh-huh.
that up. Wonder, just came to my mind, like that kind of absence, because you were saying you're looking for something that's missing,
Mm-hmm.
you know, the clause
Mm-hmm.
without the marks or something in the taxes, you know. Um, I wonder how that just all of a sudden dawned on me. I wonder how that plays out.
Yeah, well, first of all, there are four different categories of absence
Yes, I
that they've
remember
got, and
that.
I think the last two would be more relevant to arguments, right?
Mm,
Because you've got absolute absence, which means, something that is self-contradictory, or something
yes.
that can't possibly be true, or something that is confused, like if I say virtue is a triangle or something like that, where
Hmm.
it's like, well, is that true or false? Well, it's not exactly either. So that would be a kind of absence, and that would be relevant to arguments. The other one, mutual absence, where two things are taken to be just non-identical,
Hmm.
would be also relevant to absences or relevant to arguments. Sort of interesting with the last one, the mutual absence, and expressing that in terms of the non-identical. That's a term that Adorno uses, and for that he means the capacity for awareness, experience, etc., um, to evade being captured by a concept. So if there's any aspect to your experience that you can't put into words, for instance,
Hmm.
Adorno would basically call that the non-identical.
Oh, okay.
And so that capacity of, that recognition that concepts can't adequately capture some aspect of experience,
Hmm.
if that means it's a recognition that the concept is not identical to the experience or something like that, there's maybe a problem because concepts work by virtue of predication instead of identity. And so that this might not actually be a good analysis. But in any case, if there's ever a sense that some, say, concept or some object is not identical to or not doesn't adequately capture, um, say, um, if the concept doesn't adequately refer to an experience or something like that, that I suppose would also be an absence that would be
Hmm.
relevant to an argument. And
Hmm.
so you could, yeah, you could employ the theory of absences in this way as well.
Yeah, he talked. I was just looking at this. He talked about prior absence, my keys before they were made, destructional absence, my keys once they've been melted in a furnace, absolute absence,
Hmm.
the color and air, and mutual absence. For example, my keys are not my wallet, and vice versa.
Hmm.
Yeah, it's.
One thing that's kind of interesting is that it's not clear that all kinds of absence can be known, right?
Mm,
Because it might be true that you can know that there are no marks on a piece of paper or something, but it's not clear that you can know a self-contradiction,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
right? Like it just seems like that breaks your brain a little bit. It doesn't feel
Yeah.
like, so do you know that 4 plus 4 equals 8 and 4 plus 4 equals 9? It's like, no, because that's a contradiction,
Yeah. Yeah.
right? So it's not really clear how that could possibly be a known absence. It's also not clear that maybe non-identity could be known, right? Like I know that this and this aren't the same thing, so I do know that. But at least with respect to number three, that idea of absolute absence, that
Mm-hmm.
doesn't seem like something that knowledge can deal with, right? It
Mm-hmm.
Mhm.
seems like it destabilizes knowledge entirely. It's like out
Mm-hmm.
of the, or if I say, like uh um the banana is the next piece of fruit that would become president of the United States.
The next
Right?
piece of fruit. Next. Not the
Didn't make.
orange.
Mhm.
Ooh, man.
But even with prior absence,
Hmm.
I mean, I only know it's a prior absence after the fact.
Yeah.
Like if there's a
Yeah.
key that didn't exist,
Hmm.
and I say that, well, it didn't exist before it was a key. I mean, I could go around the world and everything's a prior absence, or
Well, that's true. That's
yeah,
true. Yeah.
That's
That
the
that
Dharma perspective right there.
that's the word, sorry.
hmm.
That's in a way the Dharma perspective. Everything's
Hmm.
constantly changing.
Right.
I sort of I think it's distinct from Dharma excuse me in the following way that when you talk about um things in reference to what they are yet to become or what they once were,
Mm.
then there's sort of a sense in which the thing that you're referring to, so like if I say this blob of metal is not yet a key, there's a sense in which the key is kind of the standard for or the purpose for that blob of metal. That seems
Ah,
to be implied by that, right? Which wouldn't be the case from the Buddhist perspective, right?
mm.
There is no sense of normativity to the thing that is no longer or is yet to become,
Sure.
right? It's just that no, to talk about it that way at all is a fundamental confusion,
Yeah.
Yeah.
right? But one thing that is actually kind of interesting though, um, is that this theory of absences is not a theory of imaginary beings. So, like
Mm.
for instance, an imaginary being might be like a unicorn or something.
Mhm.
Unicorns don't exist,
Mhm.
but that's not an absence.
Yeah.
Hmm.
You remember why that's not an absence? What's the key difference?
Well, it exists in the imagination, or
Yeah.
not exists, but it's real in terms of like imagination. Um,
Hmm.
so yeah, that's why I would say it's not an absence. Um,
Uh, well, absences are real too, in this sense of being knowable and so on, right?
yeah.
So that just the fact that unicorns exist in the imagination are real in that sense and are knowable in that sense. And absences are, that doesn't show that they're not the same thing.
So what's the question again? You're asking
So the
if
question is, what is the difference? And it may be that this position isn't ultimately tenable, because
okay,
I can think of a few criticisms that you could levy to this, but the idea is that non-existent entities aren't absences. Non-existent entity is understood, for instance, in terms of like, imaginary things like unicorns and square circles and all this
yeah,
kind of
yeah, yeah,
stuff, right?
yeah,
Those aren't absences.
Yeah.
right.
Why not?
Yeah, he talks about it here. I'm going back.
I wrote in the outline too. It might be easier to find.
Oh, okay. Well, let me look at your outline then.
Oh, I see. So you're saying real absence it has to do with causation?
Yeah.
Right. Okay.
So
Mhm.
now whether or not, it's kind of interesting because it does seem to me that imaginary beings can act causally. Like for instance, if I'm a kid and I believe Santa Claus is coming,
Mm-hmm.
that might cause me to go to bed early or something, right?
Yeah.
So I'm not sure why we would necessarily think that imaginary existence can't act causally,
Right.
right? But that's supposed to be the difference, that absences can stand in a causal relationship to behavior or I guess other things, right?
Causally
Um,
efficacious.
I
Yeah. Okay.
suppose like one really obvious example of that is the absence is that if you think that the brick that I take out of a wall is an absence that causes the wall to collapse,
Hmm.
then that is really acting causally in this really obvious way. Um, uh, Whereas the example with the imaginary uh, animal or the imaginary creature or something, maybe that would be something more like um, a positively articulated belief, right? Something like that, maybe, because it's not the entity that is um, standing in a causal relationship, like the gap in the brick wall is standing in a causal relationship to the collapse of the wall,
It's
whereas
non-material. It's non-material.
what's not material?
The unicorn is non-material, unlike the absence in the wall, which is, I would say,
Well,
material.
technically, I don't think the absence in a wall is material either.
Mm,
I don't think either of them are
It's
material.
just causal. It's
One
just
is
causal
one
for the
is
wall.
real. In the thing that's tricky is they also deny that it's real.
yeah.
And so maybe it's better to say the whole is present instead
Mm,
of real. Whatever. I mean, this is one of these places that there seems to be some contradiction between different authors, maybe, or something. But in any case, I mean, the hole in the wall isn't material.
mm,
It's real in the sense that it can stand in a causal relationship to the collapse of the wall.
Yeah.
hmm
Because otherwise you'd have to say, well, no, it was the brick that was taken out that stands in causal relationship. But then you would have to say, well, no, but the brick stands in the causal relationship of preventing the collapse,
hmm
right?
hmm
It's when you've got the hole there that the wall collapses,
Right, right, right.
right?
Yes, the
That
absence of
that
the break.
yeah, that's kind of the idea. So
Mm,
it's fairly interesting, and it's this I mean, they are realists about what exists. They're realists about what we can know. And so what they're saying, and this is something that's really distinct from Plato and Socrates and so on, what they're saying is among the things that really exist in the world that we can know are voids,
Uh-huh.
absences, right?
yeah, you bring up an interesting point here. So going back to the idea of space and Deek,
Mm,
um, so the wall is spatially extended. It has extension,
hmm
right? And then thinking about like the Atman or like unicorns or whatever.
mm,
I'm not sure if they have the same sort of spatial extension as like
hmm
a material thing, but they still have a causal relationship. So it seems like something that's fundamentally not spatial, which is supposed to be like, you know, the substance or like a very
hmm
important substance
hmm
underlying things. Two things that don't have the same underlying fundamental substance can still interact causally.
hmm Yeah.
Uh, right. So,
I don't think anybody would disagree with that.
mm,
Different substances and so on can still stand in causal relationships, right?
Are you asking whether some things that are not material can stand in causal relationships?
yeah.
Well, as I said, I think that yeah, first of all, Atman can stand in causal relationships as the agent of actions.
Hmm.
Wholes can stand in causal relationship to the collapse of a wall. Those are both non-material.
Hmm.
Um, you also brought up spatial extension. The thing is that, at least with respect to these causal absences, they are also spatially extended. They're not material, but they are spatially extended because you can have a small hole or a big hole,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
But you know, presumably, I, I honestly can't remember if Atman is spatially extended or not, but let's say it's not.
Yeah.
Then you would have a situation where you can have causal interaction even between things that aren't spatially extended and, say, material objects and this sort of
Isn't
thing.
that the concept of karma in some sense?
Well, yeah, I mean, karma is kind of interesting because I, I guess karma though is maybe like a higher order organizing principle that connects things that are spatially extended, right? So like this action that I do now, well, that wasn't, maybe I flip you guys off or something, and then in my next life I'm gonna suffer for that. I mean, the karma isn't itself necessarily spatially extended. Those
It's
actions are.
causal, isn't it? A
Well,
bit.
the yeah, so the thing is that action actually the word is karman, which is related to karma, but karma understood as that principle that connects deeds in one life to
Yeah.
results in another life. That itself isn't necessarily spatially extended. What it is the organizing principle that connects the spatial extension of me flipping you guys off and the ex spatial extension of me in a later life being sad and homeless,
Yeah, I was
whatever.
making not so much spatial extended. I was thinking more causal, just that it's.
Yeah, well, exactly right. But the point being that the principle itself isn't necessarily spatially extended.
Oh,
It ranges over or it supervenes on things that are spatially extended,
yeah,
but
I
it
see.
itself isn't necessarily spatially extended.
I was gonna say it's a. I can tell you're not Scottish, neither one of you, because the national animal of Scotland is the unicorn.
Oh,
You
really?
might have a problem with this.
I
Oh,
see. Well, maybe that's a good example for a way that a non-existent entity can have a causal relationship to what people do and so on. Maybe the last like 2 minutes on Vaiśeṣika that I would want to spend is just talking about the relationship between Atman and Manas, self and mind, because it's this weird thing that's quite different from Western dualism.
hmm.
Usually, Western dualism holds that what you got is matter and mind, but here we've got mind and then the further division to self.
Right.
Yeah,
And I take it, this is essentially the way this is set up that you think of Atman itself as this pure kind of function of agency. It's not even necessarily conscious. In fact, when you are fully liberated,
yeah,
you have liberated Atman even of its consciousness, even of its
yes,
mind. And the idea is that mind is just like this internal sense organ, just like we have these external sense organs, eyes and ears and so on, that um, enable perception but aren't themselves the agent of perception. They're just the
mhm,
instruments of perception.
yeah. It's the
Um,
operating system or something.
um, that's a more complicated example because I'd almost be tempted to say that Atman's the operating system, but I'm not totally sure. I think the user
Okay,
is
anyway,
probably the
let's,
Atman.
yeah, keep going.
Anyway, the point being though that, you've got these external sense organs. Mind is the internal sense organ,
Hmm.
right? So that the fact that we can, for instance, think about our consciousness, think about our ideas, and so on,
Mm.
suggests that we're able to sort of sense this inner activity, this inner world or whatever, but we don't do that through the eyes, ears, and so on. We do that through the mind.
And
But
that's very interesting that you say we can think about our consciousness because that is such a good argument. It seems to me that they're separate.
that
Consciousness and
that that
mind.
consciousness and self are separate.
And it's consciousness and mind, the way that they
Well,
separate.
consciousness and mind are the same thing. They're both translated as manas. What's different is what I'll say is this, and I put this in the outline, at least as my understanding. Maybe there are other interpretations, but consciousness is to mind as perception, say, seeing is to the eyes.
Yes, okay.
Right, that is that consciousness isn't the same thing as mind, just as perception isn't the same thing as eyes and ears.
Yes.
But also, it's this idea that consciousness isn't the same thing as Atman either, and
Right.
perception isn't the same thing as Atman. What we're describing is a relationship between an agent and instruments.
Hmm.
So you've got an agent that uses the instrument of eyes to have visual perception,
That's right.
right? With consciousness, you have an agent, the Atman, that uses the instrument of manas, mind,
Mind.
to
Yeah,
have consciousness,
that's right.
right? Which means that they're separable. Now, one of
Right.
the one of the things that's really interesting about that, of course, right, is that um, when you have this idea of liberation as absolute freedom from limitation,
Hmm.
it also involves a loss of power, a loss of ability, a loss of agency, actually, to an
Hmm.
extent, I think probably to a pretty strong extent. What I mean by that is that, if you think of limitations as also enabling constraints, they enable us to do something, right? So that if I think that, for instance, consciousness is a particular way of limiting Atman,
Hmm.
which means that it's a way of sort of dividing Atman from its non-conscious versus its conscious instantiations or something. But if I get rid of consciousness, then I also am getting rid of the particular potentiality to have a conscious state, or with respect to eyes, the potentiality to see something, hear something, and so on. And
Hmm.
this idea of moving towards Atman that is absolutely pure
Hmm.
is also a move that makes it completely inert because it no longer has consciousness. It no longer
Away
has
from agency.
perception.
Hmm.
Yeah, well, it's just sort of this free-floating absolute,
Yeah.
but as an absolute with no limitations to it, it
Right.
also loses the capacity to do anything.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, they don't say what happens when you reach this like liberation. Like, what is the state of mind, or
mhm,
what is it? Right? It's all just
mhm.
like, yeah,
They're separated. Yeah.
it's like speculative.
That's true. Yeah, I think for one thing, how could they? Because,
Yeah.
well, I don't know. I mean, it seems like Vaiśeṣikas, if they think that reality is ultimately linguistic, that I don't know. Maybe it's just that we have a imperfect use of language. I don't know. I haven't found any evidence of that position, but maybe excuse me. Um, a way to look at it, however, which is maybe not quite so daunting and nihilistic or something, it's actually the same kind of thing with Buddhism, right? I mean, essentially what it is that freedom from agency
Hmm.
means a state in which you are no longer in a relationship of manipulation to the world,
Hmm.
right? Because to act in the world is, at least in some respect, to manipulate the world,
Hmm.
right? And if you can kind of think of it that way, perhaps, that it's a sort of freedom from the desire or even the ability to manipulate, to control, to interact with in a particular way where you are the cause of effects on the world, that is a sort of equanimity or something. There's a kind of,
Mhm.
you know, peace to that, I suppose, which doesn't seem that different from nirvana. It's a little
Yeah.
bit different because I think with nirvana, it still enables engagement.
Hmm.
With, becoming pure Atman, it sort of seems like you have transcended all both desire but even ability to um, engage.
Yeah.
So
Um, I have to go, but can you post the link of the video for the rest of the
yeah,
session?
sure,
Okay.
sure.
Okay. All right. See you.
Oh, hey, nice to see you.
See you.
See you, Sandesh. Well, since there's a lot of repetition in the Buddhism stuff, maybe we can talk a little bit about my thoughts, at least about different ways of reading what's going on in Nagarjuna that aren't about propositional arguments, but are
Hmm.
rather about a sort of approach to therapy, a sort of approach to um, uh,
Perspective. Yeah.
well, language as a kind of spiritual practice or as a kind of therapeutic practice that isn't about saying true things that correspond to reality.
Yeah, they're not making definitions. They're not committing themselves, it seems, to definitions in
Well,
a way that's linguistic.
the problem is that on the surface level, they are, because the surface form of their writing is propositional.
Yeah.
In other words, they're stating things like, for instance, everything is ultimately empty.
Right.
Okay, that's proposition, right? It's either true or false, right?
Right.
However, you don't have to read it as only a proposition. So maybe I'll just give a little bit of background here. There is this approach it sort of started in the 50s, 60s, and then kind of reached its heyday in the 70s, although it's still fairly influential now. This idea of speech act theory, that whenever you analyze what people are saying, there are different approaches to it. The propositional approach is to say, okay, so this sentence means this thing, and it's either true or false, and then you look for the conditions
Yeah.
under which it would be true or would be false or this kind of thing. The other thing to remember, though, is that whenever you say anything, you're not just taking this kind of impartial view on reality and saying true or false things about it. You are actually changing reality in speaking. You're actually doing something in the world. Whenever you say anything,
Okay.
it's not just this, sort of timeless
Right.
equation that describes reality. It's a further act in reality,
Right.
right? So like, for instance, like an example of a typical speech act would be something like if I say, I promise to pay you $5.
Mm.
So usually with a proposition, what goes on is you've got a state of affairs in the world, and the sentence, this is a blue cup, describes that state of affairs, which means that what makes that sentence true? The state of affairs in the world,
Hmm. Hmm.
right?
Yeah.
But with a speech act, what it does is it's the opposite order, it's the opposite relationship. The speech act makes a state of affairs true in the world. In other words, when I say I promise to pay you $5, that state of affairs of me having an obligation to pay you $5 didn't exist until I said that.
Yeah, I get it.
Right. Okay. So if you think about what's going on with these things that look like propositions in Nagarjuna in that way, that it's not really even that they're trying to describe ultimate reality. And in fact, even the terms that they choose, like ultimate reality, like emptiness, are calculated to be ironic.
Yeah, you can't. You're right. They say that's even empty.
I mean, there are two really obvious ways to see the irony. One is to say, okay, so Nagarjuna says, my position, let's call it emptiness, is not a position.
Yeah.
But if it's a position, then how can it not be a position?
Yeah.
The other thing, what was the other thing now? Oh, now I forgot. But in
The
any
way he gets
case,
around that, can I just say, the way he gets
yeah.
around that, at least described by this book,
Oh
is
yeah,
that he
I
says,
remember the other one. The other one is that he also, at the same time,
yeah,
defines emptiness as the exact opposite of what emptiness normally means. He says that interdependent arising is what I mean by
yes,
emptiness, but then why not call it, interdependent? What is this emptiness word doing?
mm,
And there you have to see just as the rhetorical move, not that he's asserting that the world is ultimately full in this relational sense and is also empty, but
mm,
that there's a specific choice of a word that's meant to kind of be a slap in the face.
mm,
It's a kind of like shock value to the language that um, on the surface level, there are two things going on. One, these look like propositions. It looks like he's making an argument.
mm,
And two, he's using words that on the normal meaning of the words seem to point in the completely opposite direction from what
mm,
he's really saying.
mm.
And then the question would be, okay, so if we don't treat that as just like a really maybe confused argument or a bad faith argument or something, if we want to treat it as constructive,
Mm.
what can we do? We would have to interpret it as a kind of therapy. What
To
is
deal
he
with the world.
doing? What is he doing? Not what is he saying?
Mm,
What is his, position, but what is he doing
mm.
when he says this thing, emptiness, which actually means interdependent being of all reality, this thing, emptiness, that I'm putting forward is not a position. What is he doing in that?
Yeah.
Like, so I'm asking you actually, like, how can you interpret that as a therapeutic or pedagogical move?
Well, it seems to me like that is the Buddhist perspective, as I understand it, is that as you live through and you understand these cycles of rebirth, samsara and the cycles of rebirth, somehow your perspective changes to that be not so wrapped up in the drama, I'll call
Okay,
it. The
may I say
pain.
one thing? You're still
Yeah.
describing it in propositional terms,
Yeah,
right?
it seems.
But what I mean by that is saying
Mm,
that I mean you're not totally you're kind of in the domain of speech acts and so on. But what I'm asking you is this. I'll try
mm,
to make it really clear. Let's say, okay, let's say I do this. Okay, this is going to be a stupid example, but I'm just trying to get you to think
sure.
about how you can, for instance, interpret irony in a way that's not about whether the sentence I just said is true or false. Like
Okay.
I've said something like, uh, the problem is my examples are always mean. So I was going to say, nice shirt, dude. Okay, whatever. That was a stupid example, but um, now one interpretation of that, which no one would ever do on first blush, although that's not totally true. Actually, when I lived in Germany, I found that Germans are never sarcastic,
Oh,
and I would
really?
often be, or maybe that
They
was
wouldn't
20,
get you.
that was 20 years ago, but yeah, I would often say things that were just like the opposite of what I meant, and
Yeah.
in America would obviously be taken to be sarcastic,
Right.
and they were always confused. They're
Yeah.
like, but it's not cold outside or whatever, It's like,
Right. Right.
um, and so, but if I say, nice shirt, dude, um, now on the propositional level of that, Um, one thing that I might say is that it means that you have a nice shirt, and that's either true or false. It's a subjective claim because it's about taste and all that stuff. But at least in principle, it's kind of true or false. That would be the propositional analysis. But that's not how anybody ever encounters that sentence. What
Yeah.
that means is kind of like I'm walking up behind you and giving you a wedgie,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
but I'm doing it with words instead of
Right.
with actions.
Right.
But the point in speech act theory is the words are actions.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
The words just are the same thing, the same type
Right.
of
They
thing
might
as
make
giving
me
you a
feel
wedgie.
bad. They
What's
might
that?
make, they might make me feel bad and change the world.
Exactly, or make me feel better about myself or something
Yeah.
like that.
Yeah.
Okay. So as I said, that was a stupid example, and I can always
Oh, I
only
like
come
it.
up
I like it.
I always only come up with mean examples for some reason. But now back to the original question. From that perspective, what is Nagarjuna doing when he says something like um everything? And of course I don't know Sanskrit well enough to know if he's using words that involve the idea of thing or whatever. But even so, I think he probably is because, Sanskrit is an Indo-European language and it's based on nouns and all this kind of stuff. So when I say everything is ultimately nothing or everything is ultimately empty, except by empty or by nothing, I mean, oh, it's not nothing. It's actually deeply interconnected being.
Yes. But they're
So
momentary and they're constantly changing.
exactly. But from a propositional perspective, it sounds like I'm pretty confused, or I'm just making a bad faith argument, or I'm being 14 and thinking I'm deep. But from a speech act
Yeah.
point of view, what I'm doing with it
Yeah.
as a pedagogical tool,
Yeah.
as a therapeutic or kind of
You're giving me a different perspective.
I'm giving you a different perspective. I am actually enacting for you a
Yeah.
way not to be attached to things.
That's what I was trying to articulate. Yeah, it's that it's a perspective, and that's kind of therapy. Is that your perspective on all of this changes as you don't get caught up in the drama of it. As somehow you separate yourself. I'll put it in very layman terms that way. As you're not succumb to all the pain of life and the joys of
Hmm.
life,
Hmm.
and you're sort of separate yourself and see it from a more detached in a way.
Hmm.
Um,
Hmm.
yeah, that's how I kind of
So yeah, so that's all I basically mean with
yeah.
to even though what he says looks like it's a true or false sentence.
It's more of a therapy.
Like if I say, nice shirt, dude, but actually that's like giving you a wedgie is not true or false. And if you think when I say, oh, that's a nice shirt, um, yeah, the form of it, the form of what I did, the form of that action
Mm,
looks like a proposition that's true or false. But if you think of it just as giving you a wedgie with words instead of my hands,
hmm
then you can see that um, really it's not that I'm trying to describe reality. In
hmm
using words, I'm bringing about a reality,
Yeah,
right?
sure.
And so I think that understanding,
Hmm
the doctrine of emptiness and all this way, in that way, makes everything fit together in a way that doesn't end up being confusing. Now, I will say though that it is it's more complicated than that because actually the speech act of doing all that sunyata emptiness kind of talk and stuff is meant to be confusing. It's
mm
meant to be disorienting.
mm.
What's the pedagogical purpose of that, perhaps?
Make you question reality. Make you question your relationship to reality, and maybe take on a different perspective.
Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly. Make you think for yourself for one thing.
yeah.
There is a sense when we're going through the Vaiśeṣika um, approach that it's like, okay, now I better memorize all these lists of
Yeah,
things
yeah.
and get the
Do it
doctrine just
right.
right and so on and so on. There is a sense, no, it's true that you can also take a similar approach to Vaiśeṣika, but it's not quite as immediate because there's all this terminology and stuff to learn. I mean, the approach in Vaiśeṣika that is therapeutic is once you get past the terminology and you start to question, like, oh, well, how can a property inhere in a substance, even though it's changing, then you're thinking for yourself.
Hmm.
Right. And then that's a similar kind of therapeutic approach. With the Buddhist approach, I think it's a lot more straightforward and it's also a lot more literary in the following sense that it's not about making true or false claims. It's about using language poetically, ironically, in ways that kind of short circuit your normal way
Yeah.
of
Paradoxically.
reasoning.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
Well,
Um,
and in a sense, I mean, if we take a bird's eye view, it seems to me like my perspective is that all religions are in some sense therapeutic, right? They're
mhm,
ways to get people to try to deal with life and maybe have hope or like transcend their pain, and it seems
mhm,
to understand reality in a different way that gives them some relief, in a way.
mhm,
It seems to me.
mhm. Yeah,
I
I
mean, I
think
know we're
that
not
that's
looking
right.
at these as religions as much as we're looking at them
Mm.
as philosophies, but there's some
Well,
crossover.
I think that pretty much any philosophy also, even if it doesn't present itself this way, is oriented towards a kind of, if not exactly like, certainly a kind of freedom, if not necessarily
Yeah.
salvation. I mean, freedom from illusion, freedom from wrong
Yes.
thinking, this kind of thing. In fact, I think pretty much any human activity is always purposive in that way, right? Like, why, if it weren't purposive, why do anything?
Hmm.
Like, right, it's not just about learning the skills and the, tricks of the trade or whatever. It's learning all that for some purpose because
Hmm.
we as humans are kind of naturally purpose-seeking
Hmm.
beings,
Right. Make meaning.
Yeah, and so really any worthwhile human activity. I suppose there are plenty of human activities that um on the typical philosophical view would um, be called deficient attempts at seeking purpose.
Yeah.
Whatever. But it does seem to be kind of a truism that human activity is always purpose oriented.
Hmm.
Whether it's confused about it or not, there's still something that you want to get out of it. There's some value, that human activity is essentially value laden,
Hmm.
and that just means that, there are certain activities that we prefer or don't prefer,
Hmm.
and we're able to reflect on multiple sort of levels of benefit and cost and all this kind of thing, so that we can then say, even though I like eating whatever, like deep fried Snickers bars all day, I realize that there's a higher pleasure in not doing that or something, you know.
Man.
But there is I got a little technical with my question. I mean, one thing about speech act theory is that usually the way that it works is that you still get something like logical inference. Like just as I say, if I'm holding a blue cup, then there's some object in my hand.
Mm.
The second sentence was an inference from the fact that I'm holding a blue cup. Okay, that's a logical inference. The
Yeah.
way that speech act theory works is that you don't infer from the content of sentences, you infer from the fact that sentences are said.
Yeah.
Right. And so one thing that is taken to be like a rule of normal it's called conversational implicature or something, is this idea that whenever you make a claim,
Mhm.
there is this um implication that in making the claim you also believe the claim,
Yeah. Okay.
right? And otherwise, if you take it just as a proposition, it's bad faith. Like for instance, if I pretend like I believe X, Y, or Z, but I don't really, and I'm just doing it to trick you, then that's bad faith
Yeah.
and it's a
Yeah.
bad
Yeah.
argument.
It
But
comes down to the idea that you want to debate in with a kind of ethic to it that is virtuous.
That's right. And so then if you look at Nagarjuna and if you then look at, for instance, the fact that he uses the word emptiness for something that doesn't really seem to mean emptiness, um, or the fact that he makes things that look like claims, and yet then he says, "Oh, by the way, that's not a claim."
Hmm.
It looks like he's violating that principle of believing what he says.
Well, and also here I just came across this. I here's Of course they talk about two specific levels of reality and the distinction between
Well,
appearance on the
and
one
that's
hand.
yeah, that's the other one. Like calling ultimate reality ultimate is also ironic, right?
Yeah,
Because
yeah.
the
He
the
says
whole
this. He
point
says,
the whole point of ultimate reality is that
yeah,
it's not ultimate in some positive sense where you can say, oh yeah, this is
yeah,
I have seen through to the ultimate truth of reality. That's not what it
right,
is, even though he calls it ultimate truth.
yeah.
So then the
Yeah,
question,
it's a very circular kind of confusing things, but it's interesting to me. It's been making me think of stuff I've never thought of. But this whole discussion that we've been having since I met you in Seattle. Um, so they say the Buddhist point is simple but profoundly difficult to grasp. All discourse is conventional and should be utilized with this insight in mind. Language is valid only insofar as it merely points towards the ultimate truth, which in turn is a reflection upon its only purely conventional nature. It only
mhm,
points there.
yeah.
It's inadequate at actually
Mhm.
grasping it fully. It's
That's
somehow
right.
limited.
That's right. Yeah. So yeah, and so that kind of circularity or whatever you're using to describe looks like he's making claims, but it also looks like he doesn't believe the claims he's making.
Yeah,
That's only a problem if we're just looking at it as
yeah,
propositions. But if we're
yeah. That's
looking
right.
at it as an invitation
Yeah.
to the student to think for themselves, become unattached to preconceived ideas of
Yes.
truth and this kind of thing, then it's not really a problem at all. Because
Yeah.
in fact, if you think about irony, so this is the same thing with Socratic irony as well. You get this sort of thing. Irony by definition means you don't believe what you say.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Right. And so then you would think, okay, so it's just a lie or is it bad faith? No. If you can think of irony as therapeutic,
Yeah.
as a way of destabilizing dogma,
You're right.
right? As a way of practicing, you know, disattachment or cessation of grasping or this kind of
Yes.
thing,
Right.
right? And
Certainty.
there you see that it's not that you're making a claim about ultimate reality. Even the
Yeah.
term ultimate reality is self-contradictory because
Yeah.
what it means is something that is not ultimate in the sense that we can understand it.
Yeah.
Um, yeah. So one further thing, though, to talk
Yeah.
about conventional truth, which I think is kind of interesting, right, is to think about um, so one thing that you read there that I think kind of touches on this is this idea that okay, so conventional language, for instance,
Hmm.
conventional truth, whatever, can point at ultimate reality,
Hmm.
and even the term ultimate reality, because it's in conventional language, it's not ultimate.
Hmm.
So therefore, it's, language is trying to point beyond itself, but can't actually do that. It
Right.
can't, it's actually
Futile. Yeah.
systematically incomplete. It's like
Yeah.
an incomplete system or something. It
Sure.
can't actually point up its own limit, except in saying things that break language,
Hmm.
like irony or like self-contradiction or category mistakes or this kind of thing. So then I think the question that arises there that's kind of interesting because one thing Nagarjuna and his commentators, and I think also in the Dhammapada before Nagarjuna, this is there, is this idea that um, so even values, like moral values, like the idea that you ought to help other people,
Hmm.
that is a conventional understanding of reality. It's not ultimate in the sense of there being some sort of way of thinking about value that stands alone absolutely,
Hmm.
because everything's relational.
Hmm.
And so then the question is if um, that kind of value, which underwrites ethics, is only at the conventional level, how does it work as um, an actual ethical imperative. That is to say, if I'm saying that the ethical imperative is only conventional but not ultimate, then
Mhm.
it seems that you don't have the ethical imperative ultimately. So
Yeah, but
then
there's
then the
somehow
question
the
is so
right
then the question
values.
is how can you use kind of what we've been talking about with this idea to think about this not in terms of propositions but in terms of things you're
Therapy.
doing with
Yeah,
language, things you're doing with words to bring the ethical imperative of the bodhisattva to be compassionate.
right.
We could just say that when we're talking about ethics, really what we're talking about is compassion.
Yeah,
If compassion is just the conventional name, we have to come up with a way in which it's both false in a propositional level because it's just conventional, it's just a story that we
yeah,
tell ourselves, and yet
right.
it's also true because it really is the right thing to do.
Yeah, so that you're saying that ultimately there's ultimately behind many of these philosophies or all of them, there's this belief in that there is goodness.
Hmm.
And that there is some floor of goodness that we can understand as right action, let's call it, or something
Hmm.
in the world. That to me seems like what the Buddha realized and that Bodhisattvas realized. They're not just supposed to just go on a mountaintop and sit there and reach nirvana for themselves, but they're supposed to come out and help other people realize about the nature of reality.
Here's the thing I'm trying to flag there, though, right?
Yeah.
This language of supposed to, right?
Yeah.
And let me just say one thing. You've already
Yeah.
pointed up two possible responses to enlightenment: the arhat, which is you go up on the mountain and you just meditate,
Yeah.
and the bodhisattva, which is you go into the world and you help people reach
Right.
enlightenment.
Right.
If value is ultimately conventional,
Yeah.
then how do you decide between which one to do?
It's just all their other they because they also say that along with all of this understanding, there are these prescribed ways to be more virtuous in the world. And I think it comes from those values as well, right? They do say that there's these other kinds of practices.
Yeah. I think you're still stuck in propositional thinking.
I am probably, but
Well, let me just we
I
we
don't
probably
know.
have
Yeah, go
well
ahead.
let me just say it this way. Yeah, first of all, to respond to that, then you would have to ask, well, if all value or if at least any kind of understanding of ultimate value is actually just conventional, then
Hmm.
we want to ask, well, where does the prescription to act on
Yeah,
the Fourfold Path
yeah,
come
it's
from or
all
whatever,
right.
right? And so you'd still be stuck in the same problem, right?
Sure.
And it's because of propositional thinking.
Yes.
And so here's what this is, I spent some time like going over this quite a lot and thinking of how it could be
Yeah.
made sense of. Um, Trying to think of what example to bring first. Maybe I'll start with art because we're both artists and it's useful to think in this way. I mean, I think that the question about conventional truth, conventional practice, and ethics actually only operating on the conventional level, but even so, not being false because it's only conventional,
Hmm.
can be compared to the idea of truth in art or truth in literature,
Hmm.
right? That literature isn't true, it's
Hmm.
fiction.
Hmm.
But if there's anything about literature that even though it's made up,
Hmm.
there's something about it that is nonetheless true,
Yeah.
or something about the way that reading literature,
Yeah.
literature enacts something for
Yes.
us. It gives us a perspective on the world, even though
Yes.
it's not literally true.
Right. But it gets you to higher truths in yourself or higher thinking.
Yeah,
It,
the problem is we need to try to avoid fuzzy terms like higher truths because we don't. What's that?
well,
You
okay,
know.
yeah. I have a problem
Um,
with language, I think, but
well, no, I don't think that's a fairly common way to describe it. Lots
yeah.
of people talk about higher truths, but what we want to do is like, okay, so maybe thinking about it this way that, you know, um, when, say, a work of art um, reveals
Yeah.
something about how you engage with the world,
Yeah, that's
or how
right.
you could possibly engage with the world, even if you're not currently doing it
Yeah.
this or that way. It's doing so in a way that is conventional, it is
Yeah.
fictional, but it's also an expression of something that is maybe either meta or beyond, or at least other
Deeper. Yeah.
than the
Yeah.
fictional story and its specific
Yeah.
characters or specific events, right? And so you can think of it as basically being an enacting of a certain way of um, perceiving the world, acting in the world.
Yeah. Sure.
Not that it's the precise way of acting in the world that,
Yeah.
Charles Dickens writes about, but that it's sort of like a type of
Right.
engagement with the world that
Yeah.
you
Of
could then
course. Yeah.
adopt, right? What we could say then about Buddhism and nirvana as interconnected being and compassion is that even though compassion is conventional,
Hmm.
it is the conventional expression
Yeah.
of interrelated being.
Yes.
Interrelated
Yeah.
being is not the sort of thing that you could truly say a sentence about. You can say true sentences about. However, when you enact that realization or enlightenment in conventional activity, the way it's expressed is compassion,
Hmm.
right? That compassion just is interconnected being, but now we can say at this time with these people and so on,
Hmm. Hmm.
right? And it's true that in saying at this time with these people, it's not ultimate because it is just conventional. There is no you, there is no me, there is no this. However, um, those specific names, people, events, whatever, are necessary in order to disclose the higher order structure of interconnection. Just
Hmm.
in the way
Yeah.
that, like in Charles Dickens or whatever,
Yeah.
the book, it's not that the people are true,
Yeah. Right.
but
But they awaken something in you, something.
their
Yeah.
way of relating to
Yeah.
each
Yeah.
other and their way of relating to the world is
Hmm.
what's true,
Hmm.
right? And I think that that's how you have to make sense of compassion as both conventional and so therefore not real in the ontological sense, but also not false in the same way that fiction can be both literally untrue, but
Hmm.
also disclose some, as you said, higher truth, which means ways of
Yeah,
relating to
that's
other
right.
people and the world, and so on.
Yeah, that's very interesting. That's super interesting.
Okay. This is just a little tag to the end of the conversation because we didn't get to talk about everything that's interesting about Nagarjuna and this sort of ironic or paradoxical, performance-oriented way of using language. Just to summarize, we left off with this idea that perhaps we could approach the moral imperative to compassion as a sort of necessary fiction, a sort of constructive or illuminating fiction, such that it is both false and yet somehow uh, presents a model for life, a model for ways of relating to the world. And one of the things I said is just like in any work of fiction, if you simply treat it as false because whatever characters or events or whatever never happen, that's not totally adequate because in addition to the fact that you have these fictional characters, events, and so on, the truth of a narrative could be found in its capacity to show us what a certain sort of action looks like, uh, essentially to perform for us or to simply disclose or reveal to us not through propositions, but through, I suppose, in the case of fiction, expressions of certain ways of relating to the world. That might be a better way of thinking about the relationship between convention, which is ultimately false, and compassion, which is ultimately true in the sense of it being a conventional expression of ultimate truth, a conventional expression in specific terms with specific people, specific times, places, and so on, of this deep interconnectedness of ultimate reality. Now, of course, the problem is that treating it that way has the danger of reifying it. To treat it as a truth that is good for all times, in eternity. And I think that that is also to misunderstand what's going on in the imperative to compassion. Um, I think maybe a more productive way of thinking about how one relates to the world, um, such that one avoids reifying concepts like truth and so on, is to compare Nagarjuna's account of enlightenment and the path of the Bodhisattva and so on with something Adorno says in Minima Moralia. Um, you're probably familiar with the truism. I think it's often attributed to Picasso, although I don't know if he was the first one to say this, but this idea that art is a lie that tells the truth. There's a strong sense in which the narrative approach to compassion says kind of the same thing, that compassion is conventional and so therefore, in some sense, a lie. And yet, in showing us, in modeling for us different ways of relating to the world, it tells the truth. But again, the problem there is that it's easy to reify that truth that's disclosed into some new ultimate truth that we grasp and understand and kind of ossify into a fixed concept. What Adorno says in Minima Moralia, however, is not that art is a lie that tells the truth, but rather that art is magic set free from the lie of being truth. And there I think you can find a lot of resonances with Nagarjuna. This idea that even um, ultimate reality, as he calls it, is not ultimate. There is no stable truth that one can find simply because the most adequate way of expressing interdependent being in the world is not to seek truth and falsity, but rather to engage directly with each other, directly with the world. Um, one potential danger of trying to reduce our experience of the world into true or false claims is the connection that truth has to our capacity to manipulate the world, right? So, like one thing that we could say is that if I'm able to tell in any given situation certain things that are true or certain things that are false, let's say what I want to know the truth of is whether or not there's some food out there that I could eat, or whether or not there's a predator out there. If I can find, oh, it's false that there's a predator out there, then I'll know that it's safe to go get some food. And if I know to myself that it's true that there's some food out there, then I'm able to manipulate the situation adequately and so on. Um, that's obviously a very impoverished understanding of truth, but the problem is that truth is always connected to that aspect of manipulation. If by truth what we mean is correspondence to reality, corresponds to reality in the following sense that there is a reality out there that we can grasp, categorize, um, name, and so on, such that we can uh, interact with it, manipulate it to our own interests, for the sake of our own interests. What Adorno develops also in Minima Morale, or not in Minima Morale, but in negative dialectics, is this idea that we have ways of engaging with the world that are never adequate to concepts. And just because they're never adequate to concepts, they can't be named. And without names, we can't say true or false things about them. And yet, nonetheless, these aspects of our experience are real. Um, what he's worried about is the fact that, or at least the possibility that reducing knowledge to claims that are either true or false, one, leaves out the vast majority of things we actually experience, but then two is always implicated in this kind of grasping, desiring, manipulative behavior. Even if we try to manipulate the world for the highest good or something, there's still something ultimately manipulative about that. And perhaps that's something that should raise some alarm bells or something like that. So that's where he brings up this idea of magic. And here we have to understand magic as, in some sense, the other to truth. It's certainly the other to truth understood as a tool of control, a tool for controlling reality to our own interests, bending reality to our purposes, our desires, and so on. Um, Adorno basically says that magic discloses ways of aptly being in the world, aptly comporting with the world, without simply reifying the world into the sum total of relations of truth and falsity, which end up being relations of domination. Um, and so the reason that he thinks that is simply that magic, unlike uh, magic unlike truth or falsity, magic unlike reason, rationality, and so on, isn't really about grasping the world in the sense of understanding it as a tool of control. Simply, magic is a way of kind of imitating or expressing some sympathetic relationship to the world, right? And so it's you could sort of see it in the following sense, like if art, you could always say that art is a form of manipulation, like in the case of oh, I don't know, advertising and jingles and whatever. Yeah, it's music and so therefore art, but it's also art used as a tool of manipulation. But what Adorno would think of as more adequate art is a way of expressing your relatedness to the world, but in a way that is ultimately not even about truth or falsity at all. I think actually that's why for Adorno, the paradigm art here is music and not literature, because literature always has this surface by its very nature of being, in some sense, related to truth and falsity because you tell a story with fake characters or something like that. And so truth and falsity plays a role. But in music, truth and falsity doesn't even enter the picture at all, right? And yet, music can express ways of relating to the world, uh, either in the way that it expresses certain emotional resonances we might have, or expressing the ways in which the world can be beautiful without any interest attached to it, um, ways that um, music can give voice to an expression of suffering that can't be put into words, this sort of thing. That's, by the way, something also that's very important for Adorno. He says that art, the necessary condition of all art is to give voice to suffering, the suffering that can't simply be expressed in, this name or that name, this description or that description, but there's a strong sense in being in the world that there's some dimension of our experience that can't be expressed. And even that failure, that inability to express even something that's beautiful is in a sense a sort of suffering, but it's art that can give voice to that kind of suffering. In any case, the point is that art, just like magic for Adorno, is a way of relating to the world that when we're really talking about, the core maybe functions or the core attributes of art aren't really even about truth and falsity at all. And I think that that is more or less the direction you have to take when you think about um, how a position that holds that any conceptual definition of a value is ultimately conventional, not true, how that could ever enable ethical action. It has to enable it in a way that is independent of truth and falsity. And so that's why I think that the artistic, maybe narrative approach to conventional reality is the most adequate way of wrapping your head around it. Um, Maybe to sum up, one thing that you could say is you could paraphrase Adorno in Nagarjuna's terms as follows. Instead of saying art is magic set free from the lie of being truth, you could say, uh, or perhaps Nagarjuna would say, nirvana is emptiness set free from the lie of being ultimate truth. And here, emptiness is functioning as that way of relating to the world that is independent of truth claims, and yet is expressive of a specific way of relating to the world. It doesn't say that that way is true, right, the best, but it enacts it. It in some sense, chooses, it values a course of action by enacting it, not by saying it's right or true or the best or something like that, but simply in showing us what an alternative to truth-oriented engagement might look like.